Hey everyone, thanks a lot for joining us for this conversation on compliance in GitLab. I'm Jeremy Watson. I'm a product manager here at GitLab working on the managed stage of the DevOps lifecycle. I'm here with Daniel Mora and Matt Gonzalez to talk a little bit more about compliance in GitLab, our vision, direction, and where we're going. Dan and Matt, do you want to quickly introduce yourselves?
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy. So I'm Matt Gonzalez, and I'm the product manager for the compliance group within the managed stage here at GitLab. And over to you, Daniel.
I had to unmute myself, sorry. Daniel Mora, I work with these fellows in the compliance and managed group, and I do the product design and UX.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate that. So, Matt, I think we're here today to talk a little bit about our direction as far as compliance goes. It's a really interesting problem space. I know you've been thinking about it a lot, and we have a lot of exciting things that we're working on here at GitLab. Love to turn it over to you. We can hopefully share some information with our audience about where we're going.
Yeah, sounds good. So let me share my screen. And I think where I'm going to start first is walking us through this mural board because I think what really helps me is to visualize everything. And so the way that I'm currently thinking about compliance within GitLab is you have this overarching theme of frameworks, right? So every organization, every business operates within an industry or multiple industries, and those industries are regulated in some way. The common frameworks people hear about are things like Sarbanes-Oxley for the financial sector, SOC 2 for just kind of industry agnostic, a general data security best practice framework, GDPR for privacy regulation that originated in the European Union. And so we have all of these competing frameworks, but a lot of these underlying fundamental similarities, such as segregation of duties and making sure that there's password management policies and managing access within the application or the environment or system that you're using. And so these frameworks create this broad, high-level scope. And so within the frameworks, we have requirements. The frameworks define what rules need to be followed for an organization to be compliant with their regulation or the legal or regulatory framework. And so that manifests to me as compliance controls. Compliance controls are the controls or the rules that exist either at the company level, well, I guess that's at the organizational level, but inspired by or motivated by the compliance frameworks themselves. So if a compliance framework says you have to have a separation of duties between the changes that are made to your code and that code being approved to make it into your production environment, well, then you have to have controls in place that ensure you're following that procedure. And so within frameworks, the frameworks concept, we have these compliance controls, and that manifests as things like merge request approvals. Do we have a policy in place for the various scanning that might take place for the code we're trying to push? Do we have external systems that need to connect with GitLab that we're calling out to for separate in-house policies? Do we have password management? Those types of controls. Another element to compliance is what's called non-repudiation, the idea that no individual can deny that they took some action. And so that manifests for us as audit events. So the audit events feature or component of GitLab should be able to answer any question about who did what, when did they do it, in what system did the change occur. And right now, the focus is making sure that our audit events are very granular, because if there's any gap, if there's a question you can't answer, whether it's an internal or external auditor, that creates a gap. That gap then creates more work for the organization and the day-to-day users of GitLab, because you have to then have what's called compensating controls. If there is no formal control, or if there's just a gap that's out of your control, such as with a service you're using like GitLab, you have to still be able to find that data. And so audit events is we're trying to answer the questions like who took what action did they take, was that action compliant, was it authorized? And so these are the goals we're trying to achieve in terms of audit events. And then finally, we have the reporting aspect. So visibility by way of audit events is great. You can basically prove that you're compliant with the controls that have been put in place that help your company adhere to these frameworks. But you have to then be able to provide some tangible report to an auditor. That auditor could be internal or external, which is a kind of recurring theme. A lot of, especially bigger organizations, have internal compliance or audit teams, because that's that's I guess the small part of the funnel where we're going to be the team that makes sure that we're compliant with these 1, 2, 3, n number of frameworks. But we are kind of that first barrier, right? So we're the ones who are going to ask for these evidence artifacts. We're going to be the ones to make sure that policies are being followed and enforced. And so generating the evidence artifacts could be anything from show me, oh, I see now here that my mural is actually not updated, so please disregard some of these sticky notes for now. But the audit reports could manifest as anything from show me a sample of the last 6 months worth of merge requests and show me that each of those merge requests had an issue that was tied to it or associated with it that documents the change. Show me the last, let's say, week worth of project setting changes. Show me an event where changes were made to merge request approval settings. And so those events should be captured within audit events, the audit events category, or just generally within the operation of GitLab. But we have to be able to then generate the tangible evidence that users can provide to their auditors. And so that's the high level summary of how we're currently thinking about compliance.
That's awesome, Matt. Thanks for that. So in summary, it sounds like we have multiple frameworks that organizations need to adhere to, and those distill down into a variety of compliance controls, which ideally we'll be able to set within GitLab to allow enforcement of different behaviors in your instance. Like those distill down into audit events, which we can kind of roll up in a reporting at the reporting level to be able to prove to a third-party auditor that these behaviors were adhered to and the framework was followed. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I think that's a really concise way to put it, and it does kind of trickle down in that manner.
So I see something here at the top called the GitLab control framework, and there's a bunch of arrows that kind of are directing to that. Like, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So something that I'm personally very passionate about is our internal security compliance team has done a lot of great work mapping what we call internally the GitLab control framework to right now SOC 2, Sarbanes-Oxley, and generally the ISO standard for controls. And so I feel that there's an opportunity for GitLab to take this very credible thought leadership role to say, we're already doing the work to consolidate these multiple frameworks. And so if we can distill from that, right, we say, okay, well, if you enable the GitLab control framework, identity and access management 1.2, then ideally that means you're adhering to SOC 2 common control for the same requirements. You're adhering to the Sarbanes-Oxley controls for the same requirement, as well as ISO. And so by simplifying the number of frameworks you have to manage, I'm hoping that we can simplify the process of staying up to date with the evolving landscape, but also make it easier for our customers to understand what effects are going to take place using this single source of truth versus having to reference multiple frameworks at once.
I think that makes a lot of sense. If we iterate on that sufficiently, I think that could make life a lot more simple for our customers because you can trust the GCF for us to maintain that according to changing standards. And it could kind of be a way to kind of abstract away a lot of this kind of the complexity around maintaining questions around SOC 2, SOX, and ISO. It's like ideally, GitLab can be the framework that you use for that.
Right. Yeah, I think the biggest value add there is that our internal security compliance team is already going to be constantly keeping up to date with this as part of our own compliance efforts. And so it makes sense to be very efficient about that and leveraging their hard work to bring value to our external customers, I should say.
Yeah, I think dogfooding this makes a ton of sense. So I think the high level makes sense to me. Like, can we go a level deeper and talk about like maybe specific epics or issues or like the short-term goals for each of these areas and controls, events, and reports?
Yeah, for sure. So I think for compliance controls as a category, the focus right now is looking at what are the features we can add that could eventually become these resource lists, as you will, or resources of controls. So for example, if we implement something like disable self-approval at the instance level, So this is a big pain point because what happens is you have individual users in the current role and permission schemas that may be part of their job responsibility is to deploy code. And so the way things are now, they're able to go in and modify the merge request approval settings, push code, then re-enable those settings, and that creates this critical breakdown in the separation of duties requirements. And so a control like this, where we say, you know, starting with self-managed instance administrators and eventually .com feature parity, if admins can say, well, we're going to lock this down. We're going to require that at a minimum, these 3 settings for preventing the approval of merge request by the author, by a committer, and they can't modify the approvers list. If we start there and say, we think these are the 3 most critical settings within this particular context, that prevents non-administrators from modifying that, well, then in theory, we've preserved that separation of duties workflow. So things like that could be step 1. And then as we add additional features, such as give admins, self-managed admins, and eventually .com group owners the ability to restrict the changing of a profile name, that helps to preserve the identity and access management requirements, because part of non-repudiation is, again, saying that an individual can't deny that they took an action. Well, if you can change your profile name, in theory, you could say, well, that wasn't me. That was some other person that's shown in your audit events trail. And if you don't have a way to correlate the two and disprove that, then you're not maintaining non-repudiation, and therefore your audit events lose some data integrity. So longer term, where I see this going is that, you know, if we have all of these features implemented, then we can say, okay, well, maybe these first 3 features comprise what we say is GCF control 1.1. Maybe the next 3 are GCF control 1.2. And so we can then provide our customers with an experience in-app that says, based on your requirements, you know, these controls help you maintain separation of duties. These controls help you maintain non-repudiation, et cetera, et cetera. And then we create this very customizable but seamless process or experience of then defining the policies that have to be enforced within your GitLab environment.
That makes a ton of sense. So it sounds like, you know, the things that I see, the issues that you talked through and prioritized for 12.7 are kind of like these instance level behaviors and controls that allow you to, like you pointed out, disabling self-approval, disabling the ability to change your profile name to enforce non-repudiation. Have we considered kind of like a way of like showing this in like, how have we thought about the user experience? I know we've talked a little bit about in the past about like, is there a way of maybe showing these in a single place in the UI? Is that something that we're also thinking about kind of planning?
Yeah, great question. Oh, and Daniel, yes, please take this.
Yeah, so we've actually kind of started some research on this. So Matt and I have been working together along with Catherine, who's in our user research group, to try and start generating some direction on how to kind of merge all this. So we've done some preliminary work in terms of adding the compliance controls to particular sections within the settings. So for example, we have it in the admin setting, or we have it also in the project level currently.
Is there a design? I think like I was about to see something on the screen. Would one of you mind sharing your screen?
Yeah, just one moment. I'm looking for that. Here we go.
No worries. Thanks.
So this was one of the initial research proposals we were doing. This is kind of the initial workflow in just creating a new project. And so just trying to think about where we're creating these compliance protocols. So normally you would create a project. Within the project, there's a screen that allows you to set parameters. These are the current default parameters. And then the idea would be to add a new function called the compliance protocol section. We're trying to think about what that section looks like. Another solution we were trying to plan, if we go to, for example, creating something within the projects, you have your project listing. So we want to change the active project status. So we would select a project. From here, you would see the project details. And then we would go to the security and compliance section, and we're kind of trying to ideate what could this feasibly be. Currently, we have just some general ideas. We're kind of, again, in the research phase, but this would be the initial part where we would just add the GitLab control framework. From here, it would go and see if these were now compliant or not once you activated the status of that. And then from here, we would move on to looking at, for example, the merge request. You'll see that there's a notice that this has failed the compliance checks once this has been established. And all this, again, is kind of preliminary research. We're just trying to see what makes sense. Does this flow create any sort of new questions that we haven't thought of yet or any new problems? And to see how we can resolve those questions.
Yeah, I love that vision. I think that's really interesting. I love the idea of being able to apply a framework at the project level, and then it could see it kind of distill down, to the merge request level in terms of what's compliant and not. Matt, you were about to show an issue related to the merge request, I think, widget. Do you mind sharing your screen and talking through that? I'm curious when we're planning on shipping that.
Yeah, for sure. So I believe this is the issue that we're about to go over, and this is currently scheduled for 12/8. This is our current MVC thoughts based on the research Daniel just covered and what we think might manifest in 12/8. So it's been refined a bit down into this higher fidelity type of prototype, and so we think that there's the opportunity to add in this compliance settings expandable area within the project settings that would then allow a customer to say, yes, I want to enable the GitLab control framework. Right now, we're looking at the existing features we have that make sense seem to be a universal ask across the board, such as disabling self-approval at the instance and soon to be the group level for .com users. So there's some consideration there as far as timing to make sure that we have both of those features available to be able to bring this to all of our customers. Though this is the first iterative step and may later iterate to include .com, but that's where it stands right now as far as the current prototype and MVC. To Daniel's point, we're also ideally trying to include even just this informative indication within the merge request widget that says, you said that you wanted this control in place, that the merge request approval settings were restricted and enforced at all times. So we just want to show you that for every merge request, this was in fact the case. Simple visual artifacts like that we'd like to eventually generate CSV exports for, or some export for. Simple indicators like that are useful for an auditor because it answers the question of, well, you say you're enforcing it, now show me you are. And the visual indicator should also provide that detail to show, well, I guess it's already kind of there in by way of the approvers list and a screenshot of those settings being locked down. So for example, if auditor says, okay, you say that these settings are enforced, so then show me the settings, and the settings from a admin view should be in theory different than what a non-admin sees. Non-admin would be unable to make changes, which an auditor would ask, show me that they can't make changes. And then the actual indicator on the merge request widget would show that we are tracking that this was enforced. And so it's kind of that front to full start to end tracking of the process to show what we say you do, show me you're saying it, and show me the evidence.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I really like the way that's being displayed in the UI. I think that's interesting. I think one thing that we need to make sure that we consider is iteration. I think that when we're considering these frameworks, they can quickly roll up tons of different requirements and controls. I think it's okay if we just start with one. If the GCF framework only enforces one or two controls, so we can iterate on adding to them and just document very clearly what is and is not in the GCF. Because I think that iteration could be really hard here if we just kind of just let the requirements explode for these frameworks and do too much. So, but I really think it's a cool approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. The first settings or requirements that would be available would be that disable self-approval. I think realistically, the first iteration will be that it's available only to self-managed instance administrators. In a perfect world, the weighting would be small enough that we could also include .com feature parity, because I know this is a pain point for .com customers as well. But I think realistically, it would be iterating on that self-managed and then followed by feature parity to .com.
And we don't think we can accomplish both because there's no admin for GitLab.com that's user accessible. So is that the reason? We're building this at the admin level? Like, is that the reason?
Right, that would be the primary challenge in figuring out how do we bring disabling self-approval at the group level, which is another issue as well. I believe it's linked to this one. Let me find that. I don't know if I'm able to find it quickly, but there is an issue that I'll make available in the mural and the slide presentation that will be posted with this video that links to that. But there is a partner issue that brings disabling self-approval to the group level, so that .com customers will have a way to do that.
Okay, sounds good. That makes sense. I'm happy to take that into a separate conversation, but glad you're thinking about both and trying to iterate as quickly as we can by starting where we can. That makes sense. I think that kind of concludes this conversation. Thanks a lot for the help. If people want to dive into these issues and these epics and the direction a little bit deeper, do you know where they can kind of go?
Yeah, so I'll provide. I think I can provide a public mural link, I assume, but I'll provide at least the PowerPoint slide that's linked within the mural link here. The presentation just summarizes what we've talked about here, separated by categories, so the compliance frameworks, compliance controls, audit events, and audit reports. So that detail will be made available in the video description.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for that. Thanks for the conversation, y'all. This was great, really helpful, and thanks for sharing your thinking here. This is an exciting direction.
Yeah, I appreciate you guiding it along. Thanks,
Definitely.
Jeremy.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, guys. Good to see y'all. Bye.
Good to see you. See you.